Andrew Nevins is a linguist of many talents. He graduated from MIT in 2004. He had a job at Harvard for 6 or 7 years. And now he's employed at University College London, so roughly since 2012 or something like that. He's a friend of Slovenia and of University of Gorica in particular. He has been here so many times. He has published on a number of topics, published books, articles, so about whatever, 5 to 8 books authored, about 100 or so articles authored, a bunch of books also edited. And the topics I wanted to tell a small anecdote that at least 2 or 3 times it happened to me that when we were talking with Rok about some funny phenomena in Slovenian, and I asked Andrew, so what do you think about this? Do you know of any familiar situation in any other languages? Not only I know of a familiar situation, I just wrote a paper on that. The topics were very varied, from case doubling to sleuthing, so very theoretical linguistic phenomena. He was also, the topics extend way more outside of linguistics, not only as we will hear today, but at some point he said he is as a nominate for an Ig Nobel Prize. I don't know whether that is something to be proud of or not, but it seemed like a special thing for a study on the influence of alcohol on the way the second language is spoken. As part of his interest, his interests extend also outside of linguistics, which is also something that I have learned through random conversation. Was saying that, I just started, when I said something like trying to brag how I was doing beer at home or so, home brewing, he said, I just finished my second home brewing batch. So even in that respect, he, was faster and also better than me. He was also, several times that he came here, we took him to outdoor trips. So, he's not only excel in academics, but also outside of the university. So we went climbing, we went hiking. And once, I think maybe either the first or the second time he was here, I also took him to a cave. And he said at some point that was like his first cave visit and something that sparked the interest in caves for him. So maybe, this talk is then a fruit of his frequent visits to Slovenia.
It is. I know that. Thanks very much, Lanko. It's, I think, yes, my 11th time in Slovenia, my 2nd time in Vipavi, and the trip that we took to the found cave, the Najdena Jama, was very fitting to this question of the contextualization of finding artifacts. And I couldn't help but starting with what's well known to most of you, the flute, or we presume it's a flute, the oldest musical instrument perhaps ever found on Earth, which was found in Slovenia. And I take that as a contextualization to talk about this work today. Hopefully there are many people who are interested in the topic. And on the right, I have a slightly different, but still very old carving, also in bone, which involves some leaping horses, and perhaps of less interest to today's talk than the figurative aspects are these symbolic ones, these diamond-shaped, what I will call lozenges. And these diamond-shaped lozenges are half of the topic of today's talk, which is to look at the earliest traces of what we might call proto-writing. If this is the earliest musical instrument ever found, what is the earliest thing we could call a writing system? And this is joint work together with Ben Bacon, who's also based in London, and 2 researchers in the Basque Country, Andur Egortzegi and Inigo Urestaro Porta. So the work I will speak about today is very much a joint effort, and I think that work of this sort really requires a highly interdisciplinary effort. As the linguist or semioticist, if you will, on the team, I'll hope to make clear my contributions, but this kind of work can only be done, I think, in large multidisciplinary teams. I wanted to start actually taking some distance, but contextualizing this from a book that was written by my undergraduate thesis supervisor, together with a prominent figure in linguistics, Noam Chomsky, called Why Only Us? And this particular book is about language and evolution, particularly with respect to Homo sapiens. And although the book is, I highly recommend it as required reading for anyone interested in the topic, today I wanted to take a slightly different direction that I might call Not Only Us, and embrace, instead of what is very much a saltationist or discontinuous view that many people have with respect to evolution, instead a much more gradualistic and continuous view, where we look at the Paleolithic mind and instead, more generally, at hunter-gatherer cognition as a way of, perhaps for our own health and sake of the future of humanity and healthy futures for us, envision possible futures based on alternatives that were pursued in the past, not as actively, but pursued. And I very much recommend also the book by Graeber and Wengrow on this topic. And in a large sense, I feel that much of the work from the original discovery of the Neanderthals, as well as the way we talk about hunter-gatherer cognition today, has implicitly or explicitly a lot of perhaps superiorist ideologies. But I think that can impede progress sometimes in certain discoveries that are looking us right in the face. There are paintings and artifacts from 38,000 years ago of very evenly spaced notches on raven bones in the Crimea. There is evidence for medical plants and dentistry being practiced by Neanderthals, which shows scientific cognition in Asturias. And there is recent work that even looks at the cochlear volume in the ear of Krapina Neanderthals that suggests they must have had an auditory range similar to our own, so most likely language. Now, although there's been an extensive search for principles of what is called compositionality, taking two different symbols or meanings and putting them together in a particular composed way that we talk about in the field of semantics in a variety of ways that you can compose two symbols. Excellent work by, for example, the Paris group led by Philippe Schlenker, looking at compositionality with birds and with primates. There's been very little in the domain of what was the earliest hominid evidence for compositionality. And that's what I want to focus on today. There's wonderful work, in particular I'm thinking of Genevieve Van Petzinger's inventory of the recurrent symbols found all across Ice Age Europe. And this is from her MA thesis, extensive work in caves looking at all of these non-figurative signs: the crosshatch, the cruciform, the line, the peniform, the spiral, the triangle, the zigzag. Extensive documentation of where they occur spatially and temporally. Very important work, but very little, in fact, no discussion of where these symbols co-occur. We know exactly where each one occurs and when it occurred and all of that, but we don't know where they co-occur. And to me, that's the first step towards understanding a writing or proto-writing or compositional system, is co-occurrence of distinct symbols. Now, I began this work because of a collaboration that started with Ben Bacon when I first heard about his research on what you might call phenological almanacs. Now, an almanac, perhaps you've seen these, an almanac were those books that would tell you, when the rainy season begins and when the hunting season begins, and a variety of other very important ethnobotanical, astronomical, and seasonal information. A very important thinker by the name of Marshak was the first to really convincingly formulate the message that many Paleolithic artifacts that we find look at the behavioral characteristics of animals during specific seasons and traced seasonal behavior of animals in the natural world, a first step towards science. And looking at these pictures, which I hope you can see in enough detail there, you'll see that these exquisite drawings of quadrupeds, of ungulates, of bison, of mammoths, of fish, of birds found in caves that we all may have heard of, like Lascaux, Altamira, and Chauvet, very often co-occurred with dots and lines. And what Bacon et al. Did in a 2023 paper was start to count those lines. Instead of assuming that those lines represented splashes of blood or random decorative motifs like the ones we have perhaps here on the ceiling, he counted the recurrence of those dots and lines specific to each species and how they occurred alongside a Y symbol. Sometimes these 3 dots and lines would occur next to a symbol with a Y. And that Y symbol represented, according to them, an abstraction for, as you can see here, 1, 2, 3, for parturition or birthing. In other words, they suggested that this was a way of tracking the birthing cycle of animals, each species, according to a lunar calendar. A lunar calendar that started on the first day of the year, which, somewhat like today, is right when the snow began to melt. Their idea is that the first day of the year was when the snow began to melt, and looking at recurrent distributions of the number of marks for example, 200 horses, found very recurrent number of 3 marks next to the horses, and 5 marks next to the bison, and 6 next to the fish, and 2 next to the other species, and so on. And they suggested that this was a calendar that represented externalized memory systems for, hey, wait a minute, when is the birthing season of that species? Oh yeah, 3 months after the new year. By the way, most of this was not on the walls of caves, but in what are called mobiliary artifacts, little shale or stone calendars that people might have given to each other that had this information. Because I found out that Ben Bacon, who did this very important work, lived in London a couple of years ago, we got together and started working on a separate project, and that's what I want to tell you about today. I was first inspired by looking together with him at an artifact called the Lortet baton, found in Lortet. And this is a very exquisitely carved reindeer antler, which have salmon and deer in different directions. The deer is in the act of what is sometimes called belling, which is a kind of loud roaring meant to establish hierarchies and attract prey. This is a photo of what the baton looks like, which, as you can see, many of these things need to be turned into an artistic rendering given their aging. But it looks a bit like this. And so you can see exquisite detail in terms of the artistry. You can see the reindeer turning its head in the opposite direction of the fish. The fish are swimming upstream. Salmonids go all the way, salmonids, sea trout, all of those species related to salmon, swim upstream all the way to the shallow, very headwaters of a river in order to spawn, in order to lay eggs. But what are these 2 symbols up in the upper right? That's what we started thinking about. What are these 2 symbols up in the upper right? These 2 symbols up in the upper right do not reflect, let's say, the lack of artistic ability of this particular artisan. And these are found in dozens of mobiliary artifacts in this Magdalenian period, about 15,000 years ago. Here's a sample for you. Most of them are found on antlers and spears, and a particular kind of harpoon called harpoon type A that is used specifically for the salmon that are in very shallow headwaters of rivers. So today's proposal starts with the idea that this combination in the upper right of the Lortet baton, as well as many others, is compositional of 2 different glyphs. One, the rhombus, means fish, and the other, the straight line that means a pipe, unborn young. Put those together and it means salmon spawning or salmon eggs. Now, when Professor Marušić picked me up in the car on the way from the airport, he said, well, how do we know that that isn't just a vulva and a phallus, which, of course, are recurrent symbols in the natural world, and the importance of fertility and birthing are obviously things that many cultures celebrate, abundance. What I aim to do in this talk is show definitive answers to why that conjecture, as interesting as it may be, is wrong from a quantitative point of view. I first just want to share my research assumptions. What we see is not purely decorative art, but maybe a kind of notational system. It's still rendered with artistry, but it's a notational system. Such registers may not be episodic, like today I killed or saw a bison, but instead represent generalizations over past experience used for the future. That's today what we call science. And that in the limit, all of these marks are intentional. There are very few accidental or frivolous reasons, especially in a very dark cave with limited tools for accidental dots or lines. So those three assumptions begin to motivate my approach to these registers, which one could call art or artistry, but I prefer to call registers, and apply equally well, I think, to the parietal or wall or to the mobiliary cases. This leads to a field that, as far as I know, I'm the first one, who's called quantitative semiotics. And the idea here is to take all of these expert sources and make a unified corpus. Now, using text external anchors is something that's been part of decipherment always. This is what was done for the Mayan lintels. This was what was done for the hieroglyphs by Champollion. This is what's been done in every case, linear B. This is what's been done in every case of decipherment, is building a corpus of completely unknown symbols in a completely unknown language and trying to anchor them with geography, archaeology, zoology. And the images I'm going to show you span as far west as Portugal, as far east as Ukraine, as far, let's say, north as Belgium, and as far south as Calabria. At that time, the boot and the soccer ball of Italy were connected by a land bridge. These kinds of decipherments have always used frequency of occurrence. Frequency has always been used to make inference alongside contextual clues. And I really want to follow this important suggestion by the Pozniakovs that said, for these kinds of cases of statistical data, this allows us to sweep away many potential false paths to decipherment, like Professor Marušić's casual and reasonable conjecture about the lozenges and the pipes, which on quantitative grounds we can begin to compare and investigate. So I'm going to formulate 5 specific research questions today, which we'll then address quantitatively in response to these questions in this overall picture. The first is that the lozenge, depending on what it means, turns out to occur only in caves of rivers that flow into the Atlantic, not in many other caves that have rivers, but which flow, for example, into the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is too salty for salmon. The lozenge plus pipe, the combination which we say means spawning, does it occur in places that are known as being spawning sites from geographic evidence, being at the headwaters of caves in a shallow place, from the existence of harpoons like the harpoon type A, from what are called kype-jawed fish. I'll show you an image. This is what happens to the males of salmon, specifically in spawning season, or other archaeological remains. Does the pipe occur only with females, as opposed to animals that are visibly male, for example, by their antlers or other aspects of their morphology? If the pipe means unborn fetus or progeny? Does it occur primarily or only in the belly or rump of these animals, which is where birth is associated? And does the pipe occur in specific places in the animal that are not just parallel, for example, to the outline of the body, that would suggest it's not there merely for artistic purposes? Okay, so in the time that we have left, I want to keep the talk fairly brief, also to allow for a lot of question and answer. I'm going to address these 5 research questions and their implications. Okay, the first one looks at lozenge presence by rivers. Let me just double check something that may have happened here. Yes, by rivers. So here we see that the lozenge occurs in Mediterranean caves close to 0% of the time, in the Black Sea, which flows into the Atlantic, quite a bit more, and in Atlantic caves, of which there are 200, a much greater proportion. As I said, the salmon swim upstream to spawn in rivers that drain into the Atlantic and Black Sea, but not the Mediterranean. Here, if you look at this map of France, you can see exactly where the lozenges are. We've put them on the map there, of Spain, and here of France. Okay? And you see they occur in very specific places, again, with the glaciers put in place, depending on the river systems. So what we wanted to do, because the data is so limited, is the equivalent of seeing whether those kinds of results would be the ones that would happen if we flipped the coin thousands of times, right? These are historical records where the data are very limited and not forthcoming new data so much. So what is typically called null significance testing, that may be familiar to most of you, doesn't apply. The data are fixed, and we can't do what many people do in, for example, the social sciences or other sciences, where you run a power analysis and then find how much do you need for a given alpha level. Bayesian modeling takes a particular prior and is sensitive to the amount of data that is there. But it doesn't depend on a minimum number of observations. If the observations are not enough, it will just stay at the prior, which we can play with and say, let's make it 50-50 and see what will happen. Or if the data is significant enough, that will pull it towards what is called a posterior probability. Okay? So, and we can also change what will happen under various assumptions. But the more data we have, that prior becomes less important and the posterior probability moves. Okay? So in this particular case, we used a Bayesian logistic regression model. Logistic regressions may be familiar to some of you from the behavioral and linguistic sciences, to look at are lozenges a function of river systems, adding also what are called random effects like cave and river, using the equivalent of these kind of Hamiltonian Monte Carlo simulations to do the equivalent of flipping coins hundreds of times. Okay? Now, what these allow us to conclude is that these lozenges represent specific kinds of fish. The probability of specific caves having specific lozenge signs. If we start to look now at the result that's post-stratified by the frequency of each particular kind of draining system, we see that the lozenge occurs much more in caves that are on the course of rivers that would have had salmon than ones that would not have had salmon. There's one exception in our corpus. That's the Abounds Cave in Navarre. And where is that? Well, that's of great knowledge to the archaeologists. That's a cave that drains into the Mediterranean, but is just on the other side of the mountains from a cave that drains into the Atlantic. So this must have been a nexus in shared culture. This is an exception which actually begins to prove the rule that this lozenge didn't just represent fish, but specific fish. Fish that came from the Atlantic. Was it found at spawning sites? Okay. Now there are what I mentioned, these kype-jawed salmon. There are barbed harpoons. And we know certain caves were known to be near spawning sites of these fish. Okay, here you can see the kype of the male salmon. Here is an actual representation of it. You can see in cave art Here are a list of caves where, for example, people have found fish remains, okay, with very fine-grained microscopic evidence. Here are what some of the harpoons look like with those barbs. And the question is, are these sites, which are known to be spawning sites, likely to have this particular combination? Yes. Okay, so of the 43 ones that are known spawning sites, here we put the prior originally in the middle at 50-50, but given the results, the posterior probability, put these apart, very far apart. Those that are known spawning sites, very likely to have lozenge plus pipe. Those that are not known to have spawning sites, well, maybe sometimes they do, maybe sometimes they don't. What about the pipe being found only with females? Okay. Now, there are certain animal images that we are sure that are female. They have a swollen belly, knowing about the morphology of those animals. There are certain ones that we know are male. Okay. This, for example, is a male animal. This is a female woman, which was part of our corpus as well. There's a horizontal pipe across the belly there. There are horizontal pipe across the belly there. There's a horizontal pipe across the side near the belly there. Here is an animal at the Chauvet cave, visibly pregnant. Here is another human with a pipe across the belly. Here is another visibly pregnant element with an animal with a pipe across the belly. Here's another one with a pipe. Here's another one, the famous La Pileta horse that I will come back to, that has these double pipes. I call them double pipes, two parallel pipes, everywhere, all over, except in the belly, a single pipe. Okay? Now, was this just an attempt to be artistic? If so, why did the artist put two pipes everywhere except in the belly? Again, my presupposition is that there are no accidents, or that the number of accidents in the limit is 0. Here we have another one. Okay, I think this is enough. So here we added an effect for each cave with a prior, again, of 50%, expecting, okay, well, what if the prior is 50% that these pipes are found in females? Then we took it and we can post-stratify it proportional to each species, how it's represented and how we know. Now, I should tell you, by the way, that the pipe is also found in animal representations of seals and fish and birds, for which we're less certain if those were male or female. There's an exquisite amount, by the way, of pipes in seals and fish in the Cosquer caves in Marseille, which are now underwater, but there's some really nice reproductions of them. Well, the pipes are much more likely to occur with females. This shows you by animals, by each animal in our corpus: seal, megaceros, mammoth, human, horse, goat, fish, dog, deer, I should say boar, bison, bird, and oryx, and the overall post-stratified average, so which is based on the proportion for each animal for which we know for 725 instances of animals with pipes in their belly, is over 80%. Okay? These pipes are occurring in female animals, not male animals, which also, by the way, represent a much larger portion of animal images in the ancient world. What about where they occur? Okay. Now, if it means unborn young, by hypothesis, it should be more associated with the anatomical region of the belly. So we asked 3 independent coders who did not know what we were interested in to simply divide each of these animals into 5 regions and ask them, where did the pipe occur? Okay. Again, we put the prior at 20%, 20%, 20% for those 5 regions of the body, being the rump, the legs, the head, the arms, or the forelegs were relevant. Seals have arms. And the belly. Okay? So you can see this shows you a breakdown with belly by each individual animal. Oryx, more in the belly. Deer, more in the belly. Horse, way more in the belly. Seal, a little less clear. Bird, a little less clear. Dog, human, overwhelmingly in the belly. Bison, fish, mammoth, boar, goat, and megaceros. And once we take all of those and post-stratify those by species, this is what the data looks like. Here's where our prior was at 20%. Here's our posterior probability, the likelihood of a pipe to be in the belly, over 60%. Why? By hypothesis, this is an abstraction from the umbilical cord. It's an abstraction that now has its own independent life as a symbol. Here are a few representative images. They're now appearing all by themselves. Here they are on animals, fish, seals, humans, birds, and other quadrupeds. Let me go back to that for you. Now, you might look at some of these and say, well, here, how do we know that this line isn't some artistic attempt at shading or giving some three-dimensional depth to the belly or making this somehow a more veridical representation of these animals? So for that same reason, we wanted to look when the pipes occurred, what was their orientation? Perpendicular, parallel, or oblique? Okay. So for example, in this case, that line is parallel. In that case, it is parallel. Do they represent shading? Do they represent decorative marks? Again, we asked the same three coders to just say where they were without knowing that we thought that these represented unborn young or anything like that, expecting 50% of them to be perpendicular as the prior. And it turns out that if we look across all of the animals, for all of them, less than 50% is parallel to the outline of the animal. And if we just begin to look at the ones in bellies, we see again that for all of them, less than 50% of them are parallel to the outline. So those examples above show that data is not the plural of anecdote, right? Anecdotally, it might look like a couple of them have outlines parallel to the belly, but the data themselves in 700 examples do not support that. In fact, they suggest that these pipes occur perpendicular to the body, or that there's no overall trend in a specific direction. So I would argue that these begin to show cognitive precursors to a proto-writing system. Okay, now what are the ingredients of a writing system? Well, it has to be intentional. You have to want to convey a particular message. You have to have an intention of conveying a message. There has to be conventionalization. There has to be, away from, just like we find with the emergence of sign languages, for example, there has to be a move away from pure representationality or iconicity to this lozenge always means fish, and a specific kind of fish, found only in specific caves. This pipe means unborn young. And even though they may have had their origins, surely did have their origins in facts about the natural world. The lozenge may have started with fish scales. It may have even started with particular fish vulvas, but it became abstracted to mean a specific kind of fish. And of course, if we're talking about writing, there has to be graphicality and a notion of production of these in a particular way in the visual domain, if we're going to call it writing. Now, we take those elements, which Richard Sproat, for example, and others have talked about. Is there conventionalized schematization? Is there metonymy? So suppose that, for example, the lozenge is a subpart of the whole, meaning fish. Is there the complete loss of pictographic significance, which I would say happens with the pipe? And is there compositional semantics? The lozenge and pipe is the only one of those that show this composition of lozenge meaning fish or salmonid, pipe meaning unborn young, and a combination of the two that means this is a spawning site. Now, this was probably a time where people spoke hundreds of different languages. This was probably a time with extreme linguistic density. And so this constituted what you might call, or what has been called, an open writing system, one that was not necessarily anchored in a specific spoken language phonetics. And some writing systems, although very few, do start that way, but very quickly do come to represent phonics. So what happened along the way with the change in Magdalenian culture, of course, is a very important part of this picture. But this, if correct, was the earliest symbolic step towards storing information, and storing information with two different types of symbols, which put together had a compositional meaning. Now, I await any helpful comments that you may have. I think this is an area where many inquiries, questions, speculative as they may be, can all lead to new possibilities of thinking about these. And as I said, this is an area where there's very much to be done in the field of quantitative semiotics in interdisciplinary teams, and I think very much with the need for what's called open science. I don't know whether it's the case in Slovenia, but it's certainly the case in many other countries that archaeologists tuck away their data in ways that is only accessible to small groups. When we publish this paper, the entire database will be online for anyone who wants to revisit, reanalyze, to look at. That's usually, unfortunately, not done with a lot of archaeological data. Our next step certainly will be to look at the La Pileta horse, specifically in a much more general sense, not at the La Pileta horse per se, but at the double pipe. The double pipe, and to compare the distribution of the double pipe across all of these dimensions with the single pipe. What are the distributions of the double pipe in body regions compared to the single pipe? What are the co-occurrences of the double pipe? Whatever it may mean, I have my hypotheses, but of course it takes time to do some quantitative data before we know, just comparing its distribution to that of the single pipe. And perhaps even new findings await us, as has been recently found in the Bestazovka cave here in Slovenia, brand new symbolic data that involves this, what is sometimes called biform, and what it may mean. Certainly it was some kind of non-figurative symbol. And I think only with the types of quantitative semiotic questions and approach that I've developed here can those new findings await us. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the interesting talk. No? So if anyone has anything for a question, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting talk, although I'm not from this area of expertise. So my question would be, what is the usefulness or prospects of using methods of artificial intelligence in analyzing such images?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. We have thought also, for example, so I think there's a couple of answers. One is there haven't yet been, but there are some explorations of artificial intelligence for decipherment, more generally. So I mentioned the linear B script, which was found in Mycenaean on the Cretan populations, and the linear A script has never really been definitively decoded. And so there are attempts already to use AI in order to look at that. So far, AI hasn't necessarily helped with decipherment, but it's an important tool for organizing large amounts of data. I also think it's a very important tool, potentially, for example, for the documentation and extension of highly endangered languages. I think that when it comes to very rapidly generating new hypotheses, generating new sentence types, finding generalizations, the kind of bookkeeping that the linear B people did by hand on index cards, AI is certainly of great help there. One of the more specific directions that I think we want to go in our research is to look at some of these questions of classification. You know, it may have been that the three coders, for example, who said that these occurred mostly in the belly, still may have been implicitly biased. So I think one of the most immediate directions we want to go is to see whether some of those tools can be helpful in also having the same kinds of classifications. Okay, this is in the belly, this is non-perpendicular, and so forth. So in short, the answer is there's a great degree but you need to have the hypotheses first. I don't think that AI would have ever necessarily come up with the hypothesis that this was a compositional sign that meant spawning ground. But what it can do for us is a great degree of the work in the bookkeeping and in all of the potential investigations of combinations that by hand are too difficult to consider. So that's a wonderful question.
So one question I have is the uncertainty bars which you are showing here.
Yeah.
What do they specifically represent? Can you explain that?
Yeah, in our case, because my co-authors actually reject 5% and with a virulence, they actually usually go, in many cases, to 89%. So that's just a particular, I think I have that in a small place in the slides. But that's just a particular place they decided to go to that they thought was a nice prime number.
A more general question on this first artifact which you've shown, with the two salmons and the deer looking in the other direction. You mentioned that the salmons are swimming upstream. How do you know that?
I don't know that, but I think that probably what was happening is that they're certainly going in the opposite direction of the reindeer, and the reindeer were probably coming down the hills as the snow was melting.
Good evening. Thank you for the lecture. My question is about the time periods. Do you know, the time period of your all the findings that you have, and have you examined maybe the correlation between the times and so everything that you had for all of these questions?
We haven't actually looked at the development sort of over time yet. These all roughly occur in what archaeologists call the Magdalenian period. But that still spans, something like 18,000 to 12, still spans a very large span of time. And this lozenge was, I think, part of a particular culture. Right? This was a particular culture. And it's sort of gone afterwards, or maybe is found in other, the original Chinese ideogram for fish does look a bit lozenge-shaped. Again, it's a kind of abstraction from fish scales or from the overall shape of a fish, which may make sense. But the specifics of these seem to have disappeared because this was a particular culture. And this was a particular culture that all the way from Portugal to Ukraine had a great degree of trade. We know that from what's called the lithic trade, the amount of which they traded particular kinds of rocks and tools from all over. So this was a particular culture that, as climate and as many other things, possibly bacteria and so forth, that led to populations being wiped out, changed. But in terms of the specifics of looking over specific time periods, whether we can trace emergence, the lozenge itself and the lozenge, so the empty lozenge, let's say, and the lozenge with the pipe in it, start to occur around the same point in time. And that's interesting because it doesn't really suggest that first there was one and then it took them a long time to put it together with the pipe. The lozenge was there, and as soon as the lozenge was there, people started drawing pipes inside of it. I hope I answered your question in the broad outline.
Very interesting. Thank you.
The short answer is that we have not yet done specific analyses based on time because, and I think that's important, this framework, which is the one that I sort of try to usually have, is to outline a broad set of questions that have alternative answers that are mutually exclusive, like yes or no. I think that that's a guiding heuristic for almost all research, is to try to formulate questions that have mutually exclusive alternative answers. And for time periods, I haven't been able to do that yet. But it may be possible to do so. Yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Related question. So you mentioned time periods, and I'm wondering whether you know which hominin species was living in Europe at that time? I don't think you mentioned that.
Which hominid species?
Yes.
That would be, I would say, based on continuity, very, very, very much like you and me. So these are all Homo sapiens just like me and you, just like you. But I would say, based on some of the other evidence, that even further back, they were still a lot more like you and me than some of the discoveries made in Germany in the early 20th century might have led us to think.
Thank you.
So since you had that picture on, I'll take the privilege of asking a question since nobody is lifting his hand or hand. There are fish are drawn there, right? Mm-hmm. So why didn't they put the pipe on the fish itself?
Yeah, and I think that's part of a more general question. So there are certainly cases where people put the lines, for example, for the calendar that I said on the earlier case, right? And I think that's a part of a more general question is why do people draw these symbols alongside the figurative representation?
I mean, I guess a possible answer with part one being the fish and the deer are decoration, and the other piece,
really
the symbols are really the thing that tell you something. The other one is just for beauty, the other one is for, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of calendars that we buy have calendric information, which is very useful, and have a nice picture on top too, right? So it's interesting, actually, though, that there is a clean separation in this and many other ornaments between the figurative part and the symbolic part.
Since you said that you do not think that these hominids are that different from us, the present-day humans, and yet you also said that, if I understood you correctly, they are extinct. Is there a possibility that we can use our modern-day usage of symbols to decipher what they were? Since you say that they are not that different from us, and subconsciously I assume that some symbols have more or less evolutional meaning to a species. So.
Could you just repeat that last part? Just the very end, that some symbols...
That some symbols have the meaning that's evolutionally passed down on the generations. That's what I tried to say. Yeah.
I think so. I mean, archaeologists get very upset sometimes with what they call presentism, which they say is this, fallacy of somehow taking our current culture and current symbolic understanding and projecting that onto the past. But I would say we need to have that, and I embrace this continuity. I think that, in fact, as a heuristic, as I said, for much of this work, is the idea that there is continuity and gradualism. So I think that, of course, we need to take a much broader comparison of certain symbols and not only use ones that are used in our immediate culture, but I think a slice of all of them that are found with present-day humanity can be very informative, absolutely.
And since most of your findings were on the European soil, right, from Portugal to Ukraine,
Yes.
Obviously there are no more those kinds of civilizations on the European soil, but perhaps comparing it to some other less advanced, let's say, civilizations across the Earth, could that be used to further the research?
Yeah, so in a lot of this, and so I should say a couple of things. Number one is that every day the record is getting older, and some of the things that we thought were oldest, now even older stuff is being found, for example, in Malaysia. One of the things that's very significant, and there is an article about this that I believe Professor Marušić wrote for a Slovenian newspaper about the work of Aritz Irurtsun, that you can find, what's the name of the? Yeah. So I would encourage you, if you're not familiar with that work, I'll just briefly mention it, but of course you can read more there. There are, and this is on Petzinger's inventory as well, the negative hand, as you see up here. You see the negative hand? Yeah. Now, the negative hand, as a specific negative image, was made, and they're almost always left hands, by taking the hand, placing it against the wall of a cave, putting pigment in your mouth with your right hand, blowing pigment on it like a stencil, and removing the hand. Okay? That's how you create the negative image. But a huge number of those, including the caves in Gargas, France, where, for example, I've been to see these hands, as you can see here, seem to be missing some fingers. Now, were those bitten off by animals or the equivalent of the Paleolithic Yakuza? Were those cut off as rites of passage or punishment? Well, we've seen, in fact, that the kinds of hand shapes that are missing fingers there, in men, women, and children, you can tell women versus men because of the digit ratio. Women and men tend to have different ratios of the index to the ring finger. I know everyone looks at their hands at this point. But in any case, men, women, and children all had these bent hand shapes against the wall, which suggested that they were not missing fingers, but that the hands were being bent. And being bent potentially in ways that are very convergent with the typology of existing sign languages. Now, does this mean that these Paleolithic people were all deaf? Certainly, probably not. But could that sign language have been used as a secondary sign language? The Plains Indians of North America had a very extensive sign language used as a lingua franca. If anyone wants to look it up, it's called the Plains Indian Sign Language. And this was used by about 11 different tribes who had a huge amount of mutually unintelligible languages as a lingua franca. It's easier to learn one sign language, or one language at all, rather than 10 other languages to communicate amongst all of those people. Now, coming back to your question, the negative stencils of hands with bent fingers have been found not only in Ice Age Europe, but for example, in Patagonia, all the way in Argentina, and a couple of them have been found in Malaysia as well. So I think there's certainly the possibility that although those populations were not in contact, some of these recurrent solutions to the same kinds of communication in a highly multilingual society, and perhaps the first written language being a representation of that sign language, may have been parallels that were found as well. So it's, again, a very open question, and I think the kind of comparisons outside of Europe are really just the beginning. Yeah.
A sub-question. In those drawings of negative hands, were always the same fingers missing, or did it depend on the drawing? Was it like always the index finger and the middle finger?
No, there's a wide range of ones that are distinct, and so you find this, and you find this, and you find this, but they only are ones that correspond to what we can do in the air. So, you know, having just this kind of thing, you never found, right? Even though you were pressing against the cave wall where you could have done it, because it had to have represented something that was done in the air independently. But yeah, there's a huge range of ones that are used and not used, and the relative frequencies of this, and this is actually all being studied right now. Yeah. So read Lanko's article in the newspaper.
Thank you for your answer.
More questions?
Sorry, this is kind of a naive question, but you mentioned in passing that there were a lot of languages in the time period that you're talking about. So how do you estimate the number of languages, and, you know, what's a lot compared to today? And
no, I actually don't know. That is just my supposition. That's based on the fact that many hunter-gatherer populations that we've studied in places, in fact, California, where I come from, had what was called the shatter zone, where California up to, for thousands of years, had didn't have these large language families of the kinds that were found, you know, in Algonquian or in many of the large language families of the Americans. California was a shatter zone, which had huge amounts of very small languages that were unrelated, and many people think that that was related to the particular hunter-gatherer lifestyle which flourished there, given the geography, as opposed to a more agricultural one. So that's a supposition on my part, and that one we'll probably never know. But I do think it's the kind of inference we can make, again, by comparing hunter-gatherer populations at different time periods, and hopefully really seeing what we can learn from them, possibly to save our civilization.
a second unfair question, if I may. You mentioned that you have some hypotheses about the double pike.
Yes.
What are they?
I won't, yeah, I mean, I won't go. Those we can talk about in the car.
Fair enough.
Yeah, those I won't. Those, I mean, we need data to know, but we need to compare the distributions. But again, as we talked about with AI, you have to have some hypotheses first. Otherwise, so you have to start with a hypothesis. Now, there is the very interesting work I'll just mention. No, I won't. Never mind. Okay, we'll leave it at that. So the double pipe, stay tuned. Stay tuned. Maybe I can come back in about 20 years and tell you about that.
Yeah, I guess we will thank you. I think food is downstairs, and yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I look forward. Thank you very much.